Why do Jews and Muslims abstain from eating pork, while Christians don't? This question has intrigued many for centuries, sparking curiosity about the different dietary laws and cultural practices that arise from the three Abrahamic faiths. The answer goes beyond just dietary choices. It's about history, theology, and the way these religions interpret purity, holiness, and obedience to divine commandments. At the heart of the issue is a fascinating distinction. In both Judaism and Islam, pork is considered forbidden or unclean, and consuming it is viewed as an act that violates divine law. Meanwhile, Christianity, despite its roots in the same religious tradition, offers a more relaxed approach. Christians are generally allowed to eat pork, with no dietary restrictions set forth in the New Testament. So what caused this divergence, and how do these religious beliefs shape the followers of each faith today? In this video, we'll explore the reasons behind the pork prohibition in Judaism and Islam, delve into the New Testament's shift in dietary laws, and examine how all three religions interpret these guidelines in their spiritual practices. The Bible, particularly the King James Version, will be referenced throughout, allowing us to trace the roots of these beliefs back to the earliest religious texts. By the end of this exploration, we'll not only understand why Jews and Muslims refrain from pork, but also appreciate how these practices reflect deeper themes of purity, identity, and the quest for spiritual fulfillment. So why is pork so controversial? Let's find out. The story of pork prohibition goes back thousands of years, to a time when dietary laws were intertwined with survival, culture, and spiritual identity. In the ancient world, the concept of what was considered clean or unclean wasn't just about personal taste. It was a way of maintaining purity and distinguishing one's people from others. Pork, in particular, became a symbol of what was unclean, not only for Jews and Muslims but for many ancient civilizations. One key reason for the pork taboo can be traced to the nature of pigs themselves. Pigs are omnivorous animals that can consume almost anything, including garbage, carrion, and even their own feces. In ancient societies where cleanliness was a matter of survival, animals that consumed waste were seen as unfit for consumption. Unlike cows, sheep, and goats, herbivores that were easier to keep and whose meat was considered cleaner and more suitable for human diets, pigs were seen as inherently impure due to their scavenger habits. The practical health concerns surrounding pigs were also significant. In a time before modern refrigeration and sanitary farming practices, pigs could carry diseases that were transmitted through their meat. Trichinosis, a parasitic infection caused by consuming undercooked pork, was one such threat. The ancient understanding of hygiene and food safety, though rudimentary, likely contributed to the prohibition. By avoiding pork, Jewish and Muslim communities protected themselves from potential health risks. This idea of cleanliness and the symbolic nature of dietary laws is foundational in both Judaism and Islam. In Leviticus 11 verse 7 and Deuteronomy 14 verse 8, the Bible directly addresses the issue of clean and unclean animals, prohibiting the consumption of pork as part of the Jewish dietary code. The Old Testament laws given to the Israelites as part of their covenant with God delineate which animals are acceptable to eat. These laws weren't just dietary guidelines, they were spiritual commands that emphasized obedience and separation from the surrounding pagan cultures. For Muslims, the prohibition is similarly rooted in religious law. The Quran refers to pork as haram, or forbidden, in several verses. In Surah Al-Baqarah 2:173, it is stated, "He has only forbidden you dead meat and blood, and the flesh of swine, and that on which has been invoked the name of other than Allah." Just as in Judaism, the prohibition serves not only as a matter of health, but as a sign of spiritual purity. By abstaining from pork, Muslims reinforce their submission to God's will, aligning their everyday actions with their faith. The significance of this prohibition goes beyond mere health or hygiene. In the ancient world, dietary laws were also a means of defining religious identity. By following these dietary rules, Jews and Muslims maintained a distinct cultural and spiritual identity that separated them from other peoples, particularly those who engaged in practices they considered idolatrous or impure. In this sense, the prohibition of pork served as a boundary marker, demarcating the chosen or faithful from the unclean. Interestingly, despite the prohibition of pork in these ancient texts, other cultures in the same geographic region, such as the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, did not share this taboo. For them, pigs were not only an important food source, but also symbolic of fertility and abundance. This cultural divergence is one of the reasons why the Jewish and Muslim prohibitions on pork stand out. They reflect a more stringent and exclusive approach to dietary laws, where what you eat is an outward sign of your inner purity and devotion. Today, as these ancient dietary practices continue to influence millions around the world, it's important to recognize how deeply rooted these beliefs are in both health concerns and religious identity. The prohibition of pork is more than a food choice. It's a testament to the long history of human efforts to maintain purity and honor divine law, principles that continue to shape religious communities to this day. The dietary laws in Judaism, known as kashrut, govern what foods are permissible to eat and how those foods should be prepared. These laws are not arbitrary. They are deeply embedded in the spiritual and cultural identity of the Jewish people. The prohibitions on pork, along with other food restrictions, are seen as part of a broader commitment to holiness and obedience to God's commandments. At the heart of kashrut is the concept of kosher foods that are fit or proper for consumption according to Jewish law. The laws governing what is kosher come from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and are explicitly detailed in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. In Leviticus 11, God speaks to the Israelites, outlining the animals that are considered clean and unclean for consumption. For land animals, there is a simple criterion. The animal must chew cud and have split hooves to be considered clean. Pigs, however, are explicitly forbidden. In Leviticus 11 verse 7, it is written, "And the swine, though he divide the hoof, and be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud, he is unclean to you." This commandment is a key element of Jewish dietary law. The Torah's directive is reinforced by the repeated injunction in the book of Deuteronomy, particularly in Deuteronomy 14 verse 8, which mirrors the message of Leviticus, stating that the pig is an unclean animal and therefore forbidden for Jewish consumption. These verses form the basis of one of the most distinctive aspects of Jewish food laws, the prohibition of pork. But why is pork specifically singled out? Jewish scholars have long debated this question, but one explanation often offered is the idea of ritual purity. For the Jewish people, their dietary practices were never simply about nutrition. They were about living a life that was pleasing to God. Every action, even something as routine as eating, was meant to reflect the holiness and sanctity that the Israelites were expected to maintain. The dietary laws served as a constant reminder of the covenant between God and the Israelites, and by adhering to these laws, they set themselves apart as a holy nation, distinct from the surrounding peoples. Moreover, the avoidance of pork also helped reinforce Jewish identity in a region where the practice of consuming pork was common. In the ancient world, many of the cultures surrounding the Israelites, including the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, considered pigs a valuable food source, and they even held them in high esteem for their fertility symbolism. For the Israelites, abstaining from pork was not only about maintaining purity, but also about resisting assimilation into the religious and cultural practices of surrounding pagan nations. This distinct dietary practice was not merely a matter of dietary preference, it became a hallmark of Jewish identity. Throughout history, the dietary laws helped Jews preserve their unique religious and cultural identity, even in the face of conquest and exile. Whether in ancient times or in the modern diaspora, following the laws of kashrut has been a way for Jews to maintain a connection to their heritage and their faith. In contemporary Jewish practice, the laws of kashrut are still widely followed, especially within Orthodox and conservative communities. However, The level of adherence to these laws varies among Jews, with some embracing kashrut as an essential part of their religious life, while others may interpret these laws more flexibly. Nevertheless, the prohibition of pork remains one of the most universally observed aspects of kashrut. In summary, the Jewish prohibition against eating pork is not just a dietary restriction, but a profound expression of faith, cultural identity, and spiritual discipline. By adhering to these laws, Jews not only obey God's commandments but also maintain their distinctive place within the history of the covenant and the broader human story. Islam, like Judaism, has clear dietary laws that govern what is permissible for Muslims to eat and drink. These laws, known as halal permissible and haram forbidden, are essential components of Islamic life and are rooted in the Quran, the holy book of Islam, as well as the Hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Just as in Judaism, one of the central prohibitions in Islam is the consumption of pork. The Islamic prohibition of pork is explicitly mentioned in several verses of the Quran. In Surah Al-Baqarah 2:173, it states, "He has only forbidden you dead meat and blood, and the flesh of swine, and that on which has been invoked the name of other than Allah." This verse outlines the basic dietary restrictions for Muslims, making it clear that pork is forbidden, along with other foods that are considered impure or harmful. Similarly, Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:3 echoes this prohibition, stating, "Forbidden to you for food are dead meat, blood, the flesh of swine, and that on which has been invoked the name of other than Allah." These Quranic verses are direct and unambiguous, setting the foundation for the dietary laws Muslims must follow. Why is pork singled out as forbidden in Islam? The Quran doesn't provide an extensive rationale beyond the prohibition itself, but scholars and religious authorities have offered explanations rooted in health, spirituality, and the concept of purity. Just like in Judaism, the prohibition of pork in Islam is seen as a divine commandment, intended to guide Muslims in maintaining spiritual cleanliness and obedience to Allah. In Islamic theology, adhering to dietary laws like avoiding pork is a means of submitting to God's will, demonstrating discipline and devotion to the Creator. In addition to the spiritual aspect, some scholars point to health reasons for the prohibition of pork, particularly in the historical context. In pre-modern times, pork was considered a risky food, especially before the development of proper meat preservation techniques. Pigs, like in Judaism, are scavengers that consume a wide variety of substances, making them prone to carrying diseases that could be harmful to humans. While modern advances in food safety and hygiene have made pork consumption safer, the prohibition in Islam remains a matter of faith rather than health concerns alone. The concept of ritual purity is another crucial factor in understanding the Islamic stance on pork. For Muslims, purity is a fundamental aspect of their faith and daily practices. Just as in Judaism, what a person eats can directly affect their spiritual state. The consumption of pork, an animal considered impure, disrupts this spiritual purity. By abstaining from pork and other forbidden foods, Muslims maintain a state of spiritual cleanliness that is necessary for engaging in worship, prayer, and other religious rituals. Furthermore, the prohibition of pork serves to reinforce the identity of the Muslim community, just as dietary laws in Judaism help maintain Jewish identity. In the early years of Islam, Muslims were keenly aware of the differences between their practices and those of the surrounding communities, including the Jews and Christians. For example, pork was consumed in both Christian and pre-Islamic Arab societies, and by prohibiting pork, Muslims set themselves apart, marking their distinct religious and cultural identity. In this sense, the avoidance of pork became a symbol of the Muslim commitment to live according to the guidance of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. Today, the avoidance of pork remains a core tenet of Islamic dietary practice. For devout Muslims, halal food is a vital part of their religious observance, and the prohibition of pork is respected as both a spiritual command and a cultural tradition. Muslims around the world, from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, avoid pork and seek out halal food that complies with Islamic dietary laws. Even in regions where pork is commonly consumed, Muslims maintain their abstinence from this food, further solidifying its importance in both their faith and their daily lives. In summary, the prohibition of pork in Islam is deeply rooted in religious obedience, purity, and the concept of maintaining a distinct spiritual identity. Just as in Judaism, abstaining from pork is not just about avoiding a particular food, it's about aligning one's actions with the divine will and reinforcing the bond between the believer and God. In stark contrast to Judaism and Islam, Christianity has a more permissive approach when it comes to dietary laws, particularly with regard to pork. While both Jews and Muslims view pork as an unclean and forbidden food, Christians generally do not observe such restrictions. This divergence stems from theological shifts that occurred as Christianity evolved from its Jewish roots into a distinct faith, embracing a broader interpretation of the Old Testament's dietary laws. To understand why Christianity does not share the same prohibition against pork, we must first look at how the New Testament addresses the issue of dietary laws. Unlike Judaism and Islam, Christianity is not bound by the strict regulations found in the Old Testament. Early Christian teachings, particularly those found in the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, laid the groundwork for this shift in understanding. One of the pivotal moments in the Christian approach to food laws comes from the teachings of Jesus himself. In Mark 7 verse 18-19, Jesus makes a statement that challenges the traditional Jewish dietary laws, and he saith unto them, Are ye so without understanding also? Do ye not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats? This passage indicates that external food restrictions such as those in the Old Testament are no longer necessary because they do not affect the purity of a person's heart or soul. Jesus' teaching marked a radical departure from the strict food taboos in the Jewish law, signaling that internal purity, not external observance, is what matters. Jesus' declaration in Mark 7 was a key moment in Christian theology that made a distinction between the old Jewish laws and the new Christian understanding of faith. For Christians, the emphasis shifted from dietary purity to spiritual purity, and Jesus' words paved the way for a redefinition of the relationship between food and faith. Another critical moment in the shift away from Jewish dietary laws comes in the Acts of the Apostles. In Acts 10 verse 9-16, the Apostle Peter has a vision in which a sheet filled with various animals, including those considered unclean, is lowered from heaven. A voice tells Peter, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. Peter initially refuses, citing the Jewish law that forbids him from eating unclean animals. However, the voice responds, What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. This vision was interpreted as a divine command to no longer view the Old Testament dietary laws as binding on Christians. The vision served as a symbol that the restrictions on certain foods such as pork were no longer applicable to those who followed Christ. For early Christians, this was a crucial moment. As the Christian faith spread beyond Jewish communities to Gentiles non-Jews, it became clear that the old dietary laws were not required for salvation or for being part of the Christian community. The decision not to impose dietary laws on Gentile converts was solidified during the Council of Jerusalem, described in Acts 15, where it was agreed that Gentile converts to Christianity should not be burdened with the full yoke of Jewish law, including dietary restrictions. This decision was crucial for the growth and expansion of Christianity, allowing it to reach a broader, more diverse population. From this moment onward, Christians were free to eat a variety of foods, including pork, without any religious restriction. This shift did not signal a rejection of the Old Testament, but rather a reinterpretation of its commandments. The New Testament emphasis on faith in Jesus Christ as the path to salvation replaced the focus on outward adherence to dietary laws. As a result, pork and other foods that were once considered forbidden under the Jewish law became acceptable for Christians. Theologically, the Christian position on food laws can be understood as part of the larger theme of salvation through grace rather than works. In Romans 14 verse 14, Paul writes, "I know and am persuaded by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean." This statement further emphasizes that Christians are not bound by the old food laws. What matters is not the food itself, but the heart and faith of the individual. Therefore, pork and other foods that were once forbidden are no longer viewed as spiritually harmful for Christians. In modern Christian practice, while some denominations such as Seventh-day Adventists maintain dietary restrictions similar to those in the Old Testament, the vast majority of Christians today do not observe any prohibition against pork. The belief that Christians are free from the Old Testament dietary laws has allowed pork to be a common and accepted part of Christian diets, particularly in the Western world where it is a staple in many cuisines. In summary, Christianity's acceptance of pork is rooted in the teachings of Jesus and the early Christian church, which redefined the relationship between food and faith. The shift away from the dietary laws of the Old Testament allowed Christians to embrace a broader understanding of purity, where spiritual devotion is paramount and food laws no longer serve as a means of maintaining holiness. The dietary laws surrounding pork in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are rooted in the shared Abrahamic heritage of these three religions. Despite their common origin, the way each religion approaches the consumption of pork reveals both similarities and profound differences in how they interpret the divine will and their relationship to purity, tradition, and community. At their core, all three faiths emphasize the importance of living according to God's commandments. In Judaism, the dietary laws are integral to maintaining a covenant with God, as seen in the Torah. These laws, which include the prohibition of pork, serve not only as a practical guide to health and hygiene, but also as a means to maintain ritual purity. For Muslims, the prohibition of pork is similarly framed as an act of obedience to God's will. In Islam, the concept of halal and haram governs what is permissible, with pork being explicitly forbidden as haram, reinforcing the idea that purity and submission to God's will are paramount in daily life. In both Judaism and Islam, the avoidance of pork is a clear and easily observable practice. It marks the distinction between believers and non-believers and plays a significant role in defining the religious identity of Jews and Muslims. For Jews, following the kosher laws is not simply a matter of personal preference. It is an expression of communal identity and faithfulness to God's commandments. For Muslims, abstaining from pork is similarly a reflection of their commitment to the teachings of the Quran and the will of Allah, and it serves as a visible sign of piety in a largely secular world. However, Christianity presents a striking contrast. While the Jewish and Muslim prohibitions on pork are a matter of religious observance and identity, Christianity has evolved in a way that no longer adheres to these Old Testament dietary laws. The key turning point came with the teachings of Jesus and the apostolic guidance found in the New Testament. In Mark 7 verse 18-19, Jesus declared all foods clean, signaling a shift away from the Jewish dietary restrictions. Christianity's embrace of a broader interpretation of purity and spiritual devotion allows for the consumption of pork, reflecting the belief that it is not external factors, like food, that determine one's purity, but the state of one's heart and faith. This theological shift in Christianity is a key reason for the divergence in dietary practices among the Abrahamic faiths. In Christianity, the focus is less on ritual purity and more on the grace of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. This grace is viewed as a liberating force that frees believers from the burden of the Mosaic law, including its food prohibitions. The Apostle Paul's teachings in Romans 14 verse 14 emphasize that nothing is inherently unclean, and that it is the believer's relationship with God, not their adherence to dietary laws, that matters most. This openness in Christianity regarding food laws highlights a fundamental difference in how the three faiths approach religious practice. While Judaism and Islam place emphasis on outward obedience to God's commands, Christianity focuses on internal faith and the grace of God. Another key difference lies in the way each religion views the concept of ritual and identity. In Judaism and Islam, food laws, including the prohibition of pork, are essential for maintaining a visible and tangible connection to God. By adhering to these dietary restrictions, followers demonstrate their obedience and commitment to living according to divine guidance. In contrast, Christianity's less restrictive approach to food laws reflects a different understanding of spiritual practice, where the focus is on personal relationship with God rather than adherence to specific laws. Christianity's rejection of pork prohibition symbolizes its broader theological message that faith, not ritual, defines a person's spiritual standing. Despite these differences, there are profound similarities that unite these faiths in their shared heritage. All three religions view food as not just a means of sustenance but a reflection of one's devotion and spiritual integrity. For Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, food is an act of worship, a means of expressing faith, and a way of marking the sacredness of daily life. Whether it's adhering to kashrut in Judaism, halal laws in Islam, or the Christian freedom to eat whatever is placed before them, each religious tradition places great importance on the act of eating as part of the believer's commitment to God. At the same time, the divergence in how these faiths approach dietary laws, especially the consumption of pork, highlights the unique paths these religions have taken throughout history. While the dietary laws in Judaism and Islam remain a central feature of religious life, Christianity's rejection of such prohibitions underscores the distinctive theological development within Christian doctrine. Christianity's embrace of freedom from dietary restrictions reflects its emphasis on spiritual freedom through faith, as opposed to ritual compliance. Ultimately, the differing views on pork in these religions are a reflection of how each tradition interprets the relationship between law, faith, and identity. For Jews and Muslims, the avoidance of pork is a way to maintain a sense of purity and divine obedience, while for Christians the consumption of pork symbolizes the freedom brought by the teachings of Jesus and the New Covenant. Despite their differences, all three religions share a common focus on the importance of living according to divine will, and each religion offers a unique perspective on how dietary practices intersect with faith. While the dietary laws surrounding pork have deep historical and theological roots in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the way these laws are observed in the modern world varies widely. In today's globalized society, where cultures and religions intersect and influence one another, interpretations of these dietary restrictions have evolved. While the prohibitions on pork remain fundamental in both Judaism and Islam, exceptions, modern adaptations, and differing views on food laws reflect a changing world where health, culture, and personal choice play significant roles. In Judaism, the prohibition against pork is still widely observed, particularly within Orthodox and conservative communities, where adherence to kashrut is central to religious life. However, there are some exceptions and variations in how strictly these laws are followed. For example, many Jews who are not strictly observant of all aspects of Jewish law may not keep kosher at all, and even within more observant communities, some Jews may be lenient about dietary restrictions when it comes to health reasons or social situations. There is also the issue of kosher certification, which ensures that meat products, including pork alternatives, are prepared according to Jewish dietary laws. In some modern Jewish communities, there are discussions about the importance of dietary observance in the context of modern life, with some even calling for reinterpretations of these ancient rules. The rise of the kosher for Passover and kosher for all year-round markets reflects the ongoing importance of these laws, but also how they are adapting to the modern food industry. However, for those who observe the laws of kashrut to the letter, the avoidance of pork remains absolute, and any form of pork or even pork-derived ingredients such as gelatin is strictly forbidden. The discussion of modern exceptions is more often about how to observe these laws in a world filled with processed foods, factory farming, and international trade, rather than whether they should be observed. Islam shares a similar approach to pork prohibition, with the Quran's clear edicts against consuming pork and the concept of halal permissible and haram forbidden shaping the daily lives of Muslims. For the vast majority of Muslims, avoiding pork is a fundamental aspect of religious observance. However, as with Judaism, there are instances where modern interpretations and circumstances may lead to exceptions. For example, in cases of necessity or survival, such as in situations where no other food is available, Islamic scholars have agreed that it is permissible to eat pork to sustain life, a principle known as darura necessity. This principle is also applied in other cases where a person's health or well-being is at risk, and the consumption of pork is deemed the only available option. Additionally, in some parts of the Muslim world, the availability of halal-certified food is not as widespread, leading to some Muslims seeking out alternatives when halal food is not easily accessible. In certain countries, the rise of halal food certification has made it easier for Muslims to ensure that their food is free of pork and other prohibited items. Still, challenges remain, especially in Western countries where Muslims may find it difficult to access truly halal food in the mainstream food market. In these contexts, pork may not be a personal choice, but an obstacle to religious observance. In Christianity, the approach to pork has been the most flexible. The majority of Christians, as explained earlier, are free to consume pork without religious restriction due to the teachings of the New Testament, where Jesus declared all foods clean, and Paul's writings emphasized faith over ritual. However, in modern times, there are still some Christian denominations such as Seventh-day Adventists that continue to observe Old Testament dietary laws, including the avoidance of pork. These groups interpret the Bible's teachings in a way that encourages strict adherence to the health principles found in the Old Testament, believing that these laws contribute to physical well-being and spiritual purity. Beyond these traditional interpretations, many Christians today embrace a more relaxed approach to dietary restrictions. The consumption of pork is often considered a matter of personal preference or cultural background rather than religious obligation. However, in certain Christian communities, particularly those that advocate for health-conscious lifestyles or plant-based diets, there has been a resurgence in interest in the health benefits of avoiding pork, not necessarily for religious reasons but due to concerns about animal welfare, sustainability, and the health risks associated with processed meats. The growing global awareness of the ethical and environmental implications of meat consumption has also influenced Christian communities to reassess their dietary choices. In some areas, this has led to the promotion of more sustainable plant-based diets, and some Christians are choosing to avoid pork and other meats for ethical or health-related reasons rather than religious doctrine. This shift in attitude reflects a broader trend in modern society, where many individuals are rethinking their relationship with food and making choices that align with their personal values. The globalization of food culture and the rise of food alternatives have also made it easier for people to adapt their diets to meet their personal needs, including avoiding pork. For example, plant-based substitutes for pork such as tempeh, tofu, and vegan pork products are increasingly available in supermarkets and restaurants, offering individuals the opportunity to enjoy the taste and texture of pork without violating religious dietary laws. In conclusion, the prohibition of pork in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity remains an essential element of religious identity and practice. However, the way these laws are interpreted and applied in modern times varies widely. While traditional observance continues to be crucial for many, the rise of ethical, health, and cultural considerations is reshaping how individuals within these faiths approach their dietary choices. Whether due to necessity, health, or personal belief, the modern landscape of dietary laws is more nuanced than ever before, and the avoidance of pork continues to reflect both spiritual commitment and cultural evolution. The question of why Jews and Muslims refrain from eating pork while Christians do not is rooted in deep religious, cultural, and historical contexts. As we've explored, these dietary laws are not arbitrary. They reflect each faith's understanding of purity, obedience, and spiritual identity. The prohibition of pork is a vital part of the Jewish and Muslim traditions, serving as a clear marker of adherence to God's commandments and maintaining ritual cleanliness. For these faiths, avoiding pork is more than a dietary choice. It is a symbol of faithfulness and devotion to divine law. In contrast, Christianity, particularly through the teachings of Jesus and the early church, made a profound shift away from Old Testament dietary restrictions, including the prohibition on pork. The Christian view emphasized faith over ritual, and with this shift came a more flexible approach to food laws. The idea that spiritual purity is a matter of the heart, rather than what one consumes, paved the way for a broader acceptance of food choices, including pork. For Christians, pork is no longer viewed as forbidden, but as permissible, reflecting the broader theological shift that focused on salvation through grace and not adherence to ritual laws.